How often do Americans carry guns for self-defense? And how often do they use guns to defend themselves? These two questions may sound simple, but they've been at the heart of the fierce debate on guns for decades. And a new survey of American gun use, the most comprehensive ever, provides some eye-popping answers to these questions. Stay tuned and learn the details. Hey folks, I'm Mark, and welcome to the Four Boxes Diner. The anti-gun lobby wants you to think that people rarely carry guns outside the home, and they're especially interested in convincing you that successful examples of armed self-defense are even rarer. But why do these issues matter to the anti-gunner so much? It's simple, because they want to take away your gun rights, and it helps their case to portray people who carry guns outside of the home as a tiny fringe minority. And they really need to downplay the social value of defensive gun uses as well. You see, the anti-gun lobby has spent many years and a whole lot of money trying to debunk previous studies that showed widespread gun use, widespread gun ownership, and lots of defensive gun uses in this country. Well, I've got some news for them, and I've got some news for you. Big news. That's big news. A prominent political economist from Georgetown University, one of our nation's top schools, Professor William English, has just conducted and released the most comprehensive study on these issues. And the results from his 2021 study are really quite startling. So who is Professor Bill English? Well, he's a social scientist at Georgetown University. He has advanced degrees from Duke University and from Oxford. And he spent several years as a research fellow at Harvard University. In other words, Professor English's credentials as an academic and as a social scientist are impeccable. And Professor English's new survey is much more comprehensive than previous studies on the same topics. That's because Professor English's sample size of survey respondents, that's the number of people surveyed, is at least 3 times as big as the sample size used in previous similar surveys. In the social sciences, as a general matter, this means that your data, because it's so much larger, is frequently much more reliable than others with smaller sample sets. So what exactly did Professor English's survey find? First, it found that gun ownership in the United States is quite common. 31.9% of American adults, which is about 81.4 million people, own firearms right now. But what is stunning is how many Americans actually carry their guns outside of the home for self-defense purposes, or would, if they could, in certain jurisdictions. We're going to talk about that more in a moment. So here are some of the numbers from Professor English's survey. More than half of gun owners sometimes carry firearms outside of the home. Over 20 million Americans have a license to carry a handgun in public and regularly do so. And here to me is what is the kicker. More than 1/3 of gun owners, 1/3 of gun owners have wanted to carry a firearm in public, but have been blocked from doing so legally by restrictions on public carry. Now, you cannot overstate, in my view, the significance of these numbers. Professor English's work shows that carrying guns outside the home for self-defense is common among law-abiding Americans, far more common than the anti-gunners would want you to think. And that finding is hugely important, not just for you and I, but for the United States Supreme Court, who right now is looking at a case called NYSERPA, or New York State Rifle and Pistol Association, versus Bruin, addressing the question of whether or not you and I have a Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms and to carry guns outside of our homes. A big case, and Professor English's work may very well be important to the Supreme Court on that point. Now let's talk about defensive gun use. Professor English reveals that Americans use guns for self-defense far more frequently, and frankly quite successfly, than the anti-gun lobby reports or would have you believe. In fact, a staggering 31.1% of gun owners, that's about 25.3 million people, right? Think about that. 25.3 million Americans have said in his study that they use guns for self-defense. Now, this survey also reveals that there are approximately 1.67 million cases of armed self-defense every year. And this number likely may be an underestimate because remember, Professor English only surveyed current gun owners. And based on previous surveys, Professor English's results actually indicate that the true number of instances of armed self-defense every year is maybe or could be more along the lines of 2.8 million a year. But to keep things simple and conservative, we'll go with that 1.67 million number for the purposes of this discussion. By the way, I put a copy of Professor English's study down below in the comments. So if you want to check it out yourself, you should. I put it there for you to review. Now, I also want to give you a little bit of context, by the way, to compare Professor English's work with previous estimates of defensive gun uses and to show that, many of these have been all over the map. But the anti-gun lobby has frequently seized on various studies that put that number of defensive gun uses as low as maybe 100,000 per year, which is still, by the way, a pretty big number, by the way. But that's not the real number, even though it's a big number and not as big as it should be. Now, this comprehensive survey by a prominent political economist, Professor English, really shows that Americans use guns to defend themselves nearly 17 times as often as the anti-gunners, or at least many of the anti-gunners, want you to think. Now, I want to think about these numbers before we're going to get into some definitions and whatnot of what a defensive gun use is. I just want to talk about the numbers first before we drill down a little bit more. Okay, every day there are 4,575 cases of armed defense. That's thousands of Americans every single day on average who don't become victims of violent crimes because they have a gun to defend themselves. Given the large number of defensive gun uses in the United States, it may be worth noting how Professor English's study defines defensive gun use. I think it's very important to understand the different ways that people use guns to defend themselves. It's not always the way people might think. Well, Professor English's specific answer in his study, of course, is set forth in detail in the survey, which again, I link to below for your review. But according to the survey, all gun owners were asked, quote, "Have you ever defended yourself or your property with a firearm, even if it was not fired or displayed?" Well, Professor English specifically asked that respondents exclude any use of firearms as a police officer, in the military, or as a security guard. You see, this means that Professor English was measuring gun uses among Americans as civilians and not as police or in the military. Now, let's break down the gun uses a little bit more. Of those defensive gun uses identified, 18.1% of them involve the actual discharge or the actual firing of a gun. However, and this is in some ways even more interesting, 51% of the respondents showed a gun without firing it to defend themselves. And 31% actually just had to verbally tell someone that they had a gun and that was sufficient to deter and stop the threat. Now, so what this means is this following, that of the defensive gun uses surveyed by Professor English, 82% of the time, I repeat, 82% of the time, a gun is used defensively, no shots are even fired. Think about that. So let's wrap up. Make no mistake, Professor English's findings should upend the gun control debate. And here are the 3 key takeaways from this groundbreaking study that I think you should take away. First, when the anti-gunners try to further restrict the right to carry guns in public, we need to push back hard because their policies to do so would affect the rights and security of tens of millions of Americans. Second, the anti-gun laws already on the books have prevented millions more Americans from protecting themselves outside of the homes. And third, those very restrictions on carry have actual real costs because we know that cases of armed defense are common. In fact, they're a daily occurrence in the United States. They happen again 4,575 times every day in this country. So every law-abiding gun owner who is barred, prevented from carrying his gun outside the home is really being prevented from protecting himself or herself or their families from violent attack. And that's just not right. So thanks for joining me here today at the Four Boxes Diner, where we serve fresh, hot Second Amendment news and analysis. And if you like what you heard, please subscribe and help spread the word. And we'll see you soon again here at the Four Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.